Hello, my name is George Grant, and welcome to Griffin's 2022 Virtual Expo. During this presentation, Rick Yates and I will be discussing ways to manipulate plant growth with and without the use of plant growth regulators. If you should have any questions regarding the material discussed in this presentation, or anything else that you're curious about implementing into your operation, please feel free to reach out to the GGS Pro technical team using the contact information listed on this slide. The objectives of this presentation will be to discuss various factors and considerations that growers should know when using the various plant growth regulators, or PGRs, that we have at our disposal. We'll also go over some fundamental strategies every level of grower should be aware of when trying to manipulate plant growth without the use of PGRs. Rick will be finishing the presentation off by going into specific PGR strategies for a variety of common greenhouse-grown ornamental species. At this point, growers have a relatively large toolkit of PGRs to choose from. We have included this table that it lists both the brand, chemical name, and their associated generic option. For the sake of simplicity, we'll be utilizing brand names for the majority of this presentation. However, as we can see, products can vary in their labeling. We can see that Dazide has a 12-hour REI compared to B9's REI of 24 hours. Cytoflora and Fresco are approved for substrate drenches, whereas Configure and Fascination do not, respectively. Products can also have varying percentage of active ingredient, as with cholates being much more concentrated than fluorel. And finally, Sumagic is labeled for some species of fruiting vegetable transplants, where its counterpart, Concise, is only labeled for ornamentals. There are a variety of PGRs available on the market because they can be used for a variety of different purposes. Most commonly, we think of PGRs as growth retardants and accelerators. However, we can also use PGRs to intensify leaf color, change plant architecture, delay flowering, and also improve shelf life. The last bullet on the slide is somewhat controversial. However, research has shown that thrip populations drastically increase in their reproductive rate in the presence of pollen-producing flowers. We also know that higher thrip pressure increases the chance of plant-to-plant transmission of a variety of plant viruses. We can use specific PGRs to prevent or delay flower in order to schedule the crop as needed, thus indirectly preventing the process from occurring. As with most ornamentals, size plays a key role in when we have to have a saleable product. Either due to poor weather, pandemics, or other unforeseen circumstances, we may need to hold material longer than we would like to. Traditionally, growers would either pinch or shear back plant material to prevent plants from becoming too big. However, we can more effectively and efficiently and uniformly achieve the same results with the use of PGRs. This chart provides a lot of useful information. The major takeaways here are that PGRs can vary in where they are absorbed in the plant, how effective they are in slowing down growth, and their residual, how they can be applied, and their restricted entry interval, or REI. Bonsai, which is paclobutrazol, Sumagic, which is uniconazole, and Topflor, which is chloroprimidol, are all absorbed through the stems and root system, but not the foliage. This is important when you consider when to apply them during the plant's development and your production schedule. For example, applying bonsai as a spray to plants with dense canopies or little space in between them may make foliar sprays less efficient than a substrate drench. When making a plant growth regulator application, there are a variety of other factors that can influence their efficacy that oftentimes growers overlook. In hotter times of the year, when light intensities are high, ultimately high rates or more frequent applications of PGRs may be needed. Growing with large variation in the day and night temperature will also increase internode elongation and subsequently more PGRs. When applying foliar spray applications, longer drying times will increase absorption into plant tissue. Oddly enough, water quality also, such as solution pH, can influence PGR efficacy, as we will see later on with Fluorel being a great example of this. Variation in plant vigor across species and even between varieties can influence your PGR usage. We can think about younger, smaller plants, such as in a propagation scenario, requiring less PGR compared to larger, more developed plants, because they simply have more biomass and a greater root system to fuel plant growth, ultimately making it harder to slow them down. As with other pesticides, the volume applied and the uniformity of that application plays a major role in achieving expected results. Over time, with grower experience and research, we know there can be a synergism between certain PGRs such as B9 and Cycocel, now named Ultracell. Media substrates can also have an influence on the efficacy of PGRs applied when as a substrate drench. A popular example of this is using bonsai or paclobutrazol on substrates containing high amounts of pine bark can cause growers to use higher rates compared to when growing in a typical peat-based media. Based on initial research, this should not be a major issue for growers using small percentages of hydrogen fiber as a supplement in their mixes. Let's take a deeper look into how the environment at the time of application influences PGR activity. These relationships come from the research conducted by Dr. Eric Runkle at Michigan State University. When making foliar applications in a high relative humidity environment, this prolongs drying time, allowing for greater absorption. On the contrary, let's think about what induces quick drying of a foliar applied pesticide: high air movement, high temperatures, and high light levels. Thus, we would recommend making foliar applications of PGRs in the morning or evening hours when conditions are more conducive to slower drying. Research conducted by Dr. John Irwin, now at the University of Maryland, shows that not all of the PGRs applied in a foliar application may be absorbed immediately by the plant. When they re-wet a leaf surface the day after the initial application, this led to the increase of PGR activity of bonsai, B9, and sumagic, but not arest or ultracell in this specific trial. Fluorel is a very useful but finicky PGR when it comes to optimizing its efficacy. Growers routinely note a lack of consistency in the results of using Fluorel. However, most oftentimes an important factor was overlooked when it was applied. Fluorel does not translocate well within the plant, so thorough coverage over the entire plant is needed. It is important to remember Fluorel contains ethifon, which, when absorbed by the plant, turns into ethylene. Ethylene is a naturally occurring plant hormone typically associated with plant stress. Applying Fluorel to plants under any type of stress, such as drought, shipping, or transplant stress, can lead to a greater expression of this stress and potentially plant damage. Fluorel is a very acidic product, and it requires to be kept at a very acidic pH of 5.5 or below when being applied. When mixing Fluorel with high alkaline water, which is very common in the Northeast, it may be difficult to keep the solution pH below this target threshold, so adding additional acids such as sulfuric acid may be needed. We can also use a product called Indicate 5, which contains an acid as well as a colorimetric reagent that changes color as the solution pH becomes lower. This is a visual aid for making sure you have lowered your solution pH enough if a pH meter is not readily accessible. And finally, if things are not already complicated enough, we can also need to make sure to apply Fluorel at precise temperatures ranging from 55 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit for its ability to delay flower, allowing for more vegetative growth and ultimately extending that crop schedule. We can use this in a way to ultimately meet our window of sale. Dr. Roberto Lopez shows here on two common plant species that when we go above 73 degrees Fahrenheit, the number of days to flower drastically decreases. Depending on the time of year, applying in the morning or evening hours may be the only possible time when temperatures are low enough to not render the Fluorel ineffective. Dr. Lopez also shows us the importance of solution pH, which we have briefly spoken about. Here he has mixed various concentrations of Fluorel ranging from 0 to 750 parts per million. With higher concentrations of Fluorel, the solution pH should subsequently be lower, which we can see here. However, this effect is counteracted by varying levels of alkalinity in their water. As our alkalinity level increases from 50 to 300 parts per million, the pH of solution increases, and the need for additional acid to be added to reduce solution pH below a pH of 5 becomes more apparent. We briefly spoke about some tank mixing of PGRs for either maximizing labor use efficiency or inducing a synergism between the chemicals. However, as the art of using PGRs continues to be refined, determining when to use multiple active ingredients and the rates is still being evaluated on an ongoing basis. It's important you consider conducting small-scale trials or reaching out to the proper specialist before adopting this sort of strategy. From the research available and grower feedback, we know that the use of cycocell or ultracell mixed with B9 has become an industry practice for many years. This has various benefits, one of them being a synergism effect on reducing plant stress. Now, it's important to note that ultracell or cycocell has surfactant characteristics, which can then lead to phytotoxicity. So it's important to spray to glisten with this specific product and not to drip when applying it by itself or with a tank mix partner. In a propagation scenario, the use of Fluorel and B9 generates more compact growth along with greater lateral branching. Joyce Latimer at Virginia Tech showed several non-synergistic relationships between Configure, a cytokinin-containing product. However, it did show promising benefits on the ability to increase branching that may otherwise be reduced when using other PGRs by themselves. Here's an example of a propagation scenario where using a tank mix of B9 and Fleurel led to smaller internodes, greater branching, and the prevention of unwanted flowers at this growth stage. Fleurel is unique in that it often is considered as a chemical pinch product, but in reality, what it does is releases apical dominance in the plant, promoting lower axillary nodes to begin growing. Configure is a cytokinin containing PGR produced by Fine Americas. Cytokinins can be naturally produced by a plant as a hormone used to increase branching, thus increasing flower bud set. Both Fleurel and Configure are not considered to be powerful growth retardants. However, their ability to release apical dominance and increase lateral branching does generally result in more compact growth. Similar to all PGRs, slower drying conditions are ideal. And as with any PGR, waiting enough time to see the results of that application before reapplying is important to reducing the potential for overapplying, causing unintended effects on plant growth or even phytotoxicity. With all the PGR tools at our disposal, other than what the label allows us to do, how else do we decide between applying a PGR as a spray or drench? In general, spraying can be faster, especially if drenching cannot be done through chemication means. However, it can be harder to ensure uniformity and prevent possible stray drift to other non-target crops. There have been instances where foliar applied growth retardants delay or reduce bloom size compared to using substrate drench as well. Even though we are typically using much lower concentrations when substrate drenching, drenching will have a longer residual in the plant, potentially allowing the grower to reduce the total number of PGR applications made to that crop. We've talked about various benefits of using PGRs, but it's also valuable to see the potential negatives of when PGRs are not used in the correct plant, applied in excess, or in the wrong environment. A common question we get from growers when looking into a new PGR is, will it delay bloom? Obviously, there's going to be some variation depending on the rates applied and the crops being applied to, but here are some general trends we see for various PGRs. Out of these, some rules of thumb we recommend is to not use B9 more than 2 times per crop per season to prevent unwanted delay. Drenching Bonsai, Top Floor, and Sumagic, which are all 3 relatively powerful growth retardants, will minimize the chances of bloom delay over spraying. And with being one of Fleurel's benefits, Fleurel has the ability to delay flowers significantly. The average delay is about 6 weeks, but this varies by crop species. For example, Fleurel can delay New Guinea impatiens for up to 10 weeks, so is typically only used in stop plant production. This is an example of when Cycocel or Ultracell now is applied in too heavy of volumes. This grower may have applied the chemical to drip, and the excess solution coalesced on the bottom of foliage, causing the phyto damage to occur in this way. Although we do not typically associate phyto damage with B9, this grower used too high of a rate, which then led to excessively short internodes and malformation of the foliage. PGRs like bonsai can be very powerful at controlling plant growth for an extended period of time. So it is important to know your end user. In this specific situation, some patients that were over applied with a bonsai drench may have looked nice as a finished product going out the door. However, if they were meant to be planted in the landscape as they were in this situation, the residual of that bonsai drench may not have allowed them to fill that space up entirely, as we can see here. We'll round my section off of this presentation by discussing various strategies growers can use to manipulate plant growth without the use of PGRs. Similar to the art of using PGRs, the art of controlling growth without PGRs is equally as complex. You may have already heard of the term DIF or DIF, but if you have not, this is a very useful concept to be aware of. We can break down a single day of growing into average day and average night temperatures. The difference between these averages has an impact on the rate of plant stretch for many different species. A greater or more positive diff will induce greater stretching, whereas a smaller or even negative diff, meaning that the night temperature is actually higher than the day temperature, will reduce plant stress. We can also utilize a morning dip technique, where we drop the greenhouse temperature by 5 degrees below the average nighttime temperature for the first 3 hours of sunrise. This strategy additionally helps in reducing stretch in the morning hours as well as lowers the overall day temperature, reducing your overall diff. It's important to keep in mind that not all crops are affected by this method, and that lowering the average daily temperature of plants can ultimately alter the rate of flowering development. A common misconception for growers is that fertilizer has a direct effect on speeding up flower development. Assuming your plant is adequately healthy, what dictates flower development is going to be your temperature, light intensity, and photoperiod. Unfortunately, fertilizers that are termed blossom boosters, which contain excessively high amounts of phosphorus, can actually cause problems in your crop. Excessive amounts of phosphorus actually leads to increased internet elongation in many crop species, and thus more PGRs need to be applied. This table gives us an idea of how much phosphorus we are supplying our plants. At 200 parts per billion of nitrogen, we can see the equivalent amount of phosphorus some common fertilizers provide. As we can see, we are most oftentimes applying far beyond what majority of our crops require. You may consider switching to a lower phosphorus containing fertilizer, such as 21520, and seeing if you notice a positive impact on your crop's compactness and the reduction of PGR usage. We've spoken about the use of fertilizer, but water, or should I say the lack of water, i.e. drought stress, is surprisingly an effective way to stunt plant growth. Now, obviously, there is some risk involved with this strategy, so I would implement this with care. Light intensity and quality also play a major role in plant growth rate, architecture, and even flowering time. Plants always try to search out the light if it is in limited quantities, or if they're outcompeted by their neighboring plant. Plant spacing directly impacts this phenomenon. Due to the sake of time, we can't go into lighting in more detail, but the use of different light spectrums, such as lights with high amounts of blue light, can reduce internet elongation. If you should have any questions on implementing supplemental lighting or using light to affect plant growth, please feel free to reach out to GGS Pro or the Griffin Construction Department. Day length, also known as photoperiod, can impact plant growth for some plants by preventing or initiating flowering. Depending on the species, plants will reduce plant growth in the form of vegetative growth and divert their energy to making flowers, depending on the photoperiod they are exposed to. Plants who require long days to flower are obligate long day plants, and these include wave petunias and fuchsia. This is partially why we grow these species in the spring and summer months when the day lengths are longest. Some plant species will flower regardless of the photoperiod, but will flower actually faster under long days. We call these facultative long day plants, such as pansy and snapdragons and salvia. We can increase what the plants perceive as daytime by using what we call photoperiodic lights during the nighttime hours. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have short day plants. Plants who require short days to flower, such as poinsettia, naturally flower in the fall and winter months when day lengths are shortest. We also have facultative short-day plants, such as dahlias. These are going to flower faster under shorter days. We can shorten day lengths by using blackout cloth to reduce the number of daylight hours that the plants perceive. Considering the wide range of genetics we grow in this industry, it can be difficult to know what and if there are any specific photoperiodic requirements for the crops you specifically produce. There are various university resources available online, such as this article by Curry and Lopez. Whenever bringing on new genetics into your operation, it is beneficial to read through their culture guides, typically provided by the genetic producer, to determine if photoperiod is something you need to manage accordingly for. And with that, I'll be handing it off to Rick Yates, who will be going into specific PGR recommendations for various spring crops. Thank you.
Well, thank you, George, and thanks for a lot of really practical information. Everything that George has shared and everything I'll be sharing will be on a full color PDF for you that I hope you'll find a useful resource for the future. Sumagic is the only plant growth regulator with edible crops on the label. It is limited to these certain fruiting vegetables, but nonetheless, for tomato and pepper growers everywhere, and even eggplant growers, this has been a real benefit. In our experience, we feel like the best rate for most growers on tomatoes and peppers is just 2 parts per million. Eggplant don't respond nearly as strongly, so 5 part per million foliar spray makes more sense there. The label does have some real specific instructions about the stage of growth about which the Sumagic can be applied. As you can see, the 2 to 4 true leaf stage. It does allow for a second application 7 to 14 days later, but you can't exceed 10 parts per million per plant. And I think even in the case of eggplant, you would not want to do that anyway. We're going to talk about 2 plant growth regulators that have the same active ingredients in them, but have a little bit difference in their labels. That'd be Fascination and Fresco. It's unique. We're adding a cytokinin and a gibberellin, and the results of this combination are some pretty unique and widely varied plant responses, and we're going to try to go into that in some more detail in just a moment. It's applied as a foliar spray in both cases. Fresco adds a drench application, which is a relatively new PGR application for us and really for the industry. There is some research on it, which I'll share with you in a little while, some tips for using it that way. But either way, it's really unique. Quite a few things it does. Foliar sprays are known to reduce or completely eliminate the physiological lower leaf yellowing that occurs on Easter lilies, and this can really be a problem, especially when they're going into a cooler and coming out of it again. And growers have had great success using that for that purpose. It also can decrease ethylene shipping damage. Geraniums, unrooted cuttings shipped in that have been in the box too long or have any reason to believe that they may have been damaged by ethylene during shipment, there is a protocol for spraying them soon after you receive them. Will greatly reduce the amount of damage and leaf yellowing that normally occurs when that happens. It can also delay flower senescence, going back to our Easter lily example. Easter lilies that are sprayed with 100 parts per million of one of these two products, when the buds are about 2 inches long, 2 or 3 inches long, can cause those flowers to stay open 21 to 25 days, which is amazing compared to the normal lifespan of an Easter lily bloom. Really helps out growers that don't have access to coolers. They don't have to be quite as precise in the timing because they know those early blooms that open up will stay good for quite a long time, well through the holiday. We can also use these products to safely increase node elongation, so that add height to plants, and leaf expansion can occur as well. We have many years of experience using Fascination to safely add height to crops from foliar sprays. And this is a representative sample of some of the crops we've been successful with, but there's many others out there. In some cases, the crops just, for a number of cultural reasons, just aren't as large as a grower was expecting, and we can help out with that. We have also used on many occasions, we've used foliar sprays of Fascination, and you can do the same thing with Fresco to overcome over-applications of plant growth regulators. Now, this is a bit of an inexact science because different crops respond differently to Fascination and Fresco treatments, but also just how much of an overdose occurred is going to have an effect on us. What we tend to do is make multiple applications at a low rate, about every 5 days or so, and that way we can judge the plant response and know when we can stop making these rescue treatments. Typically, when we are trying to either safely add some height to a crop or overcome a PGR application, we like to start with a single foliar spray at 3 parts per million. It works fairly rapidly, especially when it's warm. 5 days is enough to see pretty much the full response, or enough of the response that you know whether or not you should treat again or not. During the low light and cooler temperatures during the wintertime, we allow a week for that. And so what we do by using a low rate, it allows us to evaluate each application so we know when we stop. One thing we don't want to do is overshoot the runway and create more elongation than we were looking for. And so this program's worked really well for us. Now, there are a few crops. For example, garden mums we know won't respond to 3 parts per million very well, so we use 5 or 6 parts per million there as a starting rate. But for most crops, 3 parts per million is a really good rule of thumb. I mentioned that the one difference between the Fresco and the Fascination label is that the Fresco label allows for soil drenches that Fascination does not. I want to thank Brian Whipker from North Carolina State University for volunteering some of the information that he learned in the trialing that he did. And so it's really important to make a full volume drench, so we want to be able to wet up the entire root system with the Fresco application. The media should be moist, of course. You don't want to apply it to plants that are under water stress, but we don't want the pots to be so wet they're going to cause leaching by making this PGR drench. If you're brave enough to use sub-irrigation with a PGR application, we want to reduce those rates by 1/4 to 1/2. I suggest you to start at 1/2. It's always easy to put more on, but once you've applied it, you're committed. Allow 7 days for results. That's pretty similar to what we were mentioning for foliar sprays. And good common sense, you need to have enough of a root system there to take this material up before you make the application. Dr. Joyce Latimer at Virginia Tech University conducted a really interesting trial to demonstrate the effectiveness of using Fresco or Fascination as foliar sprays to overcome over applications of PGRs. And In this case, she took these poor Gara plants and absolutely overregulated them on purpose. 220 part per million drenches of piccolo, and piccolo is the same active ingredient as bonsai. So 2 and 3 weeks after transplant, these two drenches were made. Well, she then applied Fresco, that was done 7 days after the last drench of the piccolo, and you can see that even very low rates, 1-2.5 part per million spray, was already having a pretty good effect. And at 5 parts per million, it really totally unlocked the plants, and that probably is the best treatment of all. I mentioned we normally recommend a 3 part per million spray, so a grower doing that and waiting 5 days would have made the second application for a total of 6 parts per million, and that plant would look very similar to what you see at 5 parts per million there. These pictures were taken 10 days after the Fresco treatment was made, so really amazing response from a massive overdose. We want you to be really careful with your PGR rates, but when mistakes happen, there is help out there. I'm going to spend some time talking about plant growth regulator strategies for particular crops. We're going to start off with spring baskets, and then we'll talk about springtime flatted and potted material after that. Many growers have found that combination planters in the springtime are very profitable and very popular with their customers. One of the challenges they run into is that often they desire to put together a combo with plants that have very different PGR requirements. One we often see is growers that want to mix vegetative petunias in with other annual crops that don't need nearly as much growth regulation as those vegetative petunias do. So here's what you can do. An example where most of the plants in the mixed combo would really only need 2 part per million bonsai or piccolo drench. What you can do is you can pre-treat the petunia trays before the transplanting time with a 2 part per million bonsai drench. Then after the REI is up, you can go ahead and transplant that combo, and then a week or two later you can make a second 2 part per million drench to everything. So your petunias end up essentially with 4 parts per million bonsai, and the rest of the combination planter gets the correct rate for them, which is about 2 parts per million. So there's a lot of variations on that, but I think it's a strategy that you might want to employ. Some growers prefer liner dips to drenches. In a couple of cases where you have particularly hard to regulate things, that might make sense, but I think for the most part, we advise growers to go ahead and make the drenches. We feel like the results are nearly similar, and it's a lot less trouble to drench it than do the liner dips. Now, if you decide to go that way, there's only certain products that are labeled to be used as liner dips, and anybody involved in the process of dipping these flats in the PGR solution and then putting them on carts or what have you, they're all considered applicators and handlers. And the personal protection equipment on labels of pesticides and plant growth regulators generally require a lot more stringent PPE for people actually involved in the application compared to those that are just re-entering into a treated area before the REI is finished. So keep that in mind. It is important that the flats that you are dipping need to be in need of an irrigation so they take it up effectively. And most growers find they only need to soak the plants for 1 to 2 minutes to get the full effect. We're going to talk about some specific rates, recommendations, and I hope you'll find that helpful. There are certainly other PGRs beyond the ones that we're going to mention that can be legal and very effective on these same crops. Also, you should consider these rates a starting point. We have a lot of grower experience with it, so we're confident in the rates. But the health of your crop, the environment in your greenhouse, a lot of the things that George talked about, the environment can have a big impact on the effectiveness of PGR treatment. So we need to acknowledge there are variables out there, and you'll have to work out the rates that are very best for your growing practices in your facilities. I'm going to kind of cherry pick some of these. Our GGS Pro Technical Reference Guide has a really full guide of annuals and even a pretty good selection of perennials in it. But I wanted to highlight a few of them that I thought you might find interesting. We've often said that you don't want to get bonsai or sumagic or even top floor, any of the powerful PGRs around begonias, but that was before some of these more real vigorous begonias have come into practice, and so low rates of bonsai can be extremely effective and safe on them. For example, the dragon wing petunias, foliar sprays, I prefer to use a 2.5 part per million foliar spray, but if it's gotten a little bit ahead of you and you really need to stop them, you can go as high as 5 parts per million. And those are low rates, but they are effective. And you can make repeat applications if you need it without any impact on blooming. What a lot of growers like to do is they will wait till they're pretty close to finished size, and depending on what part of the country they're in and how much they want to regulate them, somewhere in the range of a quarter to a half a part per million bonsai drench. And at that point, in a beautiful container, they'll just pretty much sit there and bloom, and it does not reduce the bloom size. So a very desirable treatment. Fuchsia is a little bit more nuanced in the applications there. We really think that early floral applications make a lot of sense at 500 parts per million for fuchsia to cause them to branch extremely well. And a lot of growers will make multiple applications every 2 weeks at 500 parts per million. That's perfectly fine, but because of the fact that they're very day length sensitive and they won't start to initiate until the days get longer, we want to make sure that our last treatment is completed by February 25th. Otherwise, we're going to start to delay the natural season bloom date. Now, about 2 to 4 weeks after, either if you're going to hand pinch or if you went with the Florel method, 2 to 4 weeks after that last pinch or Florel, we want to make a 1 part per million bonsai drench. Now, in previous years, we had recommended 2 parts per million for certain varieties, and we've kind of changed our tune. We think that the best looking plants and the best results are just using 1 part per million bonsai drenches. Something very interesting is that it'll cause the fuchsia to bud up and bloom further up the stem. You know how they tend to pretty much bloom down at the growing tips, but they'll bloom further up the stem when they've been treated with bonsai. And so the initial flush of flowers is much greater. And so using this schedule, you'll just have a riot of flowers open on your fuchsia for the Mother's Day holiday. So a very desirable effect. There's a few old school, really vigorous woody type varieties that might respond better to 2 parts per million. But if you haven't done it before on that variety, I suggest using 1 part per million and just trial 2 parts per million on a couple and see what you think. We'll be talking about calliopes, very popular cross between ivies and zonals. This will be the Calliope large series that will apply to these PGR recommendations. They actually are really quite responsive to PGRs, and so we end up actually recommending rates for the calliopes that are lower than we do for typical ivy and zonal geranium varieties. So let's jump right in. We like a 350 part per million foliar spray of Florel soon as the plants are established. And for most plants, if they arrived in good shape or you're producing them from your own cuttings that you rooted on site, 7 days is enough. When we see the first leaf or two coming out of the growing tip after transplant, we know they've taken off, and that'd be a good time to make that application. Now, in the intervening time, you can use 1,000 parts per million of Psychocell as a foliar spray. And of course, the Psychocell's changed now to Ultracell, even though most of you still have Psychocell on your shelves, but the rates are the same. And so 1,000 parts per million can be really used as often as needed to keep them shaped up. When we get to about 75% of the desired finished size, then we can talk about doing one of two things. We can either use a foliar spray at 2.5 parts per million, which is a very low rate. That's typical what we would use on pansies in late winter, so really low rate. Or if you wait a little bit closer to the finish line, you can make a 1/4 part per million bonsai or piccolo drench, and that's all you're going to need, and they'll just stay there and bloom, and it doesn't reduce bloom size in any way or delay the bloom if you follow this protocol. The Guinea impatiens are particularly difficult to regulate with PGRs. We do have some advice for you that I hope will help. As opposed to the other crops where we almost universally recommend Florel for them, unless you're producing stock plants in order to take cuttings off them, we don't recommend you use Florel at all in the Guinea impatiens. It delays the bloom so long, even at low rates, that we think it's unworkable for most people's program. If you are doing stock plants, you can talk to GGS Pro, and we'll share Dr. Jim Faust's program from Clemson University on the very low rates and timing that you need to do that. Now, in terms of finished production, you have a couple of options here. We found that top floor is a really good option for New Guinea impatiens, and the range of rates is between 5 and 10 parts per million as a one-time foliar spray. Because the varieties do vary, it's something you're going to want to trial. I would start off at 5 parts per million, and you can always make a second application at 5 parts per million for the more vigorous varieties. In a similar fashion, we would use the same rates for bonsai as foliar sprays. Now, we do have some information. If you're growing some of the seed-grown New Guinea impatiens, the rates are much lower, usually just 2 to 4 parts per million. And we thank Ball Seed for that recommendation. And for all of these, if you decide to go with the bonsai drench, we're using very low rates, an 1/8 to 1/4 of a part per million. And that range of rates, again, I would start with an 8th part per million. If you haven't done it on your varieties before, you could always reapply if you need to. Lithomia, the sweet potato vine, most of your normal dark leafed and mahogany leaf varieties will do very well with Florel applications. And since we're not worried about them coming into bloom, you can really repeat it every 2 to 3 weeks. And you can have a very nicely branched plant. And it not only causes more branching, but it reduces internode elongation. So, and since it doesn't respond very well to any of the other PGRs, probably a really good choice for you. Lobularia, also known as Snow Princess, proven winter variety there. There's a couple of spray options. We really feel like the best option for regulating the height of them is a 2 part per million bonsai or piccolo drench. We've had a lot of success with that. The vegetative trailing portulaca, often referred to as purslane, actually is a hyper responder to Florel. 500 parts per million will cause defoliation. Now, in each case where that's occurred, the plants did recover just fine, but obviously not something we want to do. So we're recommending 300 parts per million of Florel, and that seems to work just great. In terms of bonsai drenches, if you haven't tried it before, I suggest starting out at 1 part per million, but a lot of growers, especially in the southern half of the U.S., like to use 2 parts per million to get adequate hold there. Terenia is another interesting one when it comes to Florel. It actually causes the leaves to get hard and leathery, and it's quite prolonged effect. It takes quite a while for them to grow out of it, so we don't recommend Florel at all on Terenia. Usually with the breeding that's available to you today, we usually don't need any PGRs at all, but a 2,500 part per million B9 foliar spray will work great, and if you really needed a 1 part per million bonsai drench, we'll make them stop and just bloom. Verbena is probably the flip side of Florel. It responds well, but it actually comes back into bloom much sooner than most crops do after Florel application. So for that reason, growers often make multiple applications at 2-week intervals. It only takes about a month for them to come back into bloom, sometimes less when the days get longer towards May. So you certainly have that option available to you. It does respond well to B9, but we think the best option is a 1 to 2 part per million bonsai drench, and the rate that I would use there would depend on the vigor of that particular variety. Some of the newer genetics that have the multicolored flowers aren't quite as vigorous as the older varieties, so they may do just fine with 1 part per million, but if you know it to be a vigorous variety, by all means give it a 2 part per million drench. Going to get into some annuals that are typically produced either in flats or small pots, and so we'll start off with Alyssum. And I was amazed as a grower to find out how well a 1 part per million bonsai drench worked. Now, the ideal way to grow Alyssum, as soon as they've germinated and they got a little bit of growth on them, is to put them outside where it's cool, and they'll tolerate quite a bit of cold weather. I've had Alyssum go down into the mid-20s, leaves turn yellow, but one application of fertilizer greened them back up, and they finish great. Sometimes we just don't have the ability to put them outside, or the weather's just not cool enough to get it done, in which case that 1 part per million bonsai drench is really the treatment of choice. Angelonia really doesn't respond well to the more powerful PGRs. Very little effect from liner dips and drenches of bonsai on Angelonia, but the growers have worked out some pretty good tank mixes here. I think the best tank mix for most growers is to, soon after that first pinch, to apply B9 at 2,500 parts per million tank mix with Psychocell, now called Ultracell, at 1,000 parts per million. You can see some other ranges of rates out there, and even a tank mix with A-Rest. It's pretty expensive, so that's my recommendation, but you do have a range of rates you can choose from there. It's just a picture of Alyssum that couldn't get outside and a 1 part per million drench, and you can see there's no impact on bloom size. They're very uniform, nice and tight, absolutely gorgeous. Moving on to fibrous begonias. Now, this is the case where the normal bedding plant type begonias, you never want to apply the stronger PGRs, bonsais, your magic top floor to them. They turn into petrified plants. They'll never grow again. However, Psychocell can be used, and again, called Ultracell, can be used to good effect. We find for most of the varieties, 750 parts per million just applied to glisten does a great job. Be careful not to apply the Psychocell and get the yellowing because the leaves of begonias are so waxy. It tends to want sprays to puddle up anyway, even though Psychocell and Ultracell have a surfactant built into it. So make sure you're just missing it over the top. In some series, the white varieties are more vigorous than the pinks and the rose and red colors, in which case you can go as high as 1,000 parts per million there. B9 is more effective. I think there's a little bit less room for error with that compared to Cycocell and Ultracell. Non-stop begonia is pretty similar. We like to use 750 parts per million. Typically, one or two applications. If you're going to make two applications, leave about 2 weeks between the two applications. That's really all they need. They're pretty well controlled on their own. But it does make the plants tone up nicely and maybe even increases branching a little bit. The seed-grown coleus is a really good example where a PGR can increase your shelf life. As a grower, I just felt like bedding flats of coleus were just about ready to sell this week. They were perfect next week, and if they weren't sold by then, the week after, we were cutting them back. And so the advent of bonsai has really done a great job in prolonging that saleable window and avoiding cutting anything back. 1 to 2 parts per million, and that's going to be a little bit of grower preference there. Again, if you haven't done it before, I'd start with 1 part per million, but some growers have reported they really prefer to use 2. Vegetative coleus, this is a different animal altogether. We strongly recommend Fleurel for a couple of reasons. One is that it helps with the branching for sure, but also the last thing we want are these coleus coming into bloom, and by making 1 or 2 Fleurel applications soon after they're established, can do a really good job of keeping them vegetative. From there, we like to go to a bonsai drench, and I made a note there that the varieties that have mostly light green or yellow in their pigmentation in the foliage aren't nearly as vigorous. There's not as much chlorophyll there, so a 1 part per million drench would be appropriate. Most of the other varieties, you're probably going to want to use 2 parts per million to make sure they hold on. Dusty Miller is another spring annual that I always preferred to get it outside, whether I was growing it in cell flats or 4-inch pots. But if that can't be done, then a bonsai drench at 1 part per million does an excellent job, and it does increase the branching, in my opinion, as well. Cucurbitaceae would be a good example of a crop that is very sensitive to PGRs, and I separated into summer and winter grown crops because there's a pretty dramatic effect there. But even for a summer grown crop, we're only talking about using 2,500 parts per million B9, and you might be able to do it a second time if it's needed. In recent years, we've kind of migrated to using bonsai, but you can see our foliar spray rates are low, in the range of 10 to 15 parts per million, and just a 1/4 part per million bonsai drench. If you're growing it during the wintertime, even through early to mid-spring, you can see our rates are even lower. 1,250 parts per million B9 is a spray, or 1/8 of a part per million bonsai drench. At those rates, it does a really good job. If you overregulate, particularly with the B9, what you'll find is that the flowers open up right down in the crown of the plant. The petioles are so short that they don't come up above the plant. They're blooming right down in the crown. It's really undesirable. The ornamental millet makes a really nice case study for some of the effects that Fleurel can have on a plant. I want to thank Dr. Peter Conjoyan for the slides I'm about to share with you. And he's the one that worked out this protocol of making 2 applications of Fleurel as a foliar spray 14 days apart. And what Peter found was the ideal time to start these treatments was when the plants are 8 to 12 inches tall. You can use bonsai drenches at very high rates. That's pretty expensive. I think Fleurel is considerably cheaper, but that option is out there for you. So let's take a look at some of the effects that the Fleurel has. This is the stage of growth, just to give you an idea what the plants look like. You can see that at lower light levels in the middle of the winter, we're not getting much of the dark pigment color we like in the foliage, but that'll come with time. So here we go, from left to right, a control plant that got no treatment whatsoever. As you can see, the considerable height reduction from 1 Fleurel application at 500 ppm, and it really didn't delay the bloom at all. The second application gave us a really well-branched and better-looking plant, but obviously some bloom delay going on there. That's not the whole story. If you take a look at the base of the plant, look how much thicker the plants are with the increasing number of Fleurel applications, and you can even see some adventitious rooting, especially in the one that received 2 treatments. So depending on what your finished product needs to look like, and if you're putting it in a combination with something else, what size planter you need, maybe 1 application is enough. If you really like the look of the 2 applications of Fleurel, just bear in mind there'll be a week or 2 of flower delay to get that same effect. Bedding plant petunias, due to their vigor and their propensity for stretching, provide some challenges. A lot of growers are very happy with a 5,000 part per million B9 application as a foliar spray. The key is not to use it too early, even though we're anxious to get some PGR in there. When the overall plant, looking down over the top, is about 1.5 inches in diameter, that's a really good time to make that application. Now, some growers will continue to make repeat applications of B9. We believe that's an unacceptable bloom delay that's caused by that. So since B9 does work so well on petunias, we're fine if growers want to make that first application at 5,000 ppm. But after that, we really think they're better off to switch over to either a bonsai or a top floor drench. And you can see bonsai rates are pretty high, 2 to 3 parts per million. We like to do it about 14 days after either transplant, if you're going to use bonsai all the way, or 14 days after the B9 spray was made. Top floor seems to work really well around 2 parts per million. And here's a picture. This courtesy of Joe Moore at Lucas Greenhouses some years ago. And you can see the results. This was a 3 part per million bonsai drench. It was the only PGR that was applied 14 days after transplant, and clearly there was no bloom delay, and the plants are branching freely and look really great for one application. And I think when we're thinking about our spring PGR applications, we need to consider where bonsai drenches or piccolo drenches or even sumagic or top floor drenches can save a lot of labor over multiple applications of foliar sprays. I included this slide because I think it really shows we got to be careful. We can't give one rate for salvia because of such a wide, there's such a wide array of salvias, but also the way that they respond. So first we'll talk about the much more vigorous ones in terms of PGR requirements, the typical salvia splendens. And whether you're talking about medium-sized or tall varieties, use pretty much the same rates. 5,000 parts per million B9 as a foliar spray works well. And some growers will do that early on to tone them. But when push comes to shove, a 2 to 3 part per million drench, and that would be based on how vigorous that variety is. So the shorter varieties, a 2 part per million drench. The more vigorous, the taller ones, a 3 part per million drench. Or top floor can be used at 1 part per million, so another good use for top floor there. And where the difference really comes in, we're talking about the Fascination type salvia, such as Victoria Blue, and there's some other good ones out now. You can see the rates are much, much lower, especially when you look at the bonsai drench. So instead of 2 to 3 parts per million that we use on Salvia splendens, we're talking about a 0.5 part per million on the Fascination type, such as Victoria Blue. We've seen considerable bloom delay. If growers go in at 2 parts per million on this type of salvia, you'll have a significant bloom delay. You won't be happy. Seed-grown snapdragons, well, if we can get them in color in the flat, they sell on site, and for the dwarf ones, it's very easy to accomplish that with bonsai. We really like, although a 30 part per million spray will work quite well, we like to use a 3 part per million drench, and we do that both on the dwarf varieties and the taller ones. The difference is that we'll end up selling the dwarf ones in bloom, where the medium to taller ones we'll sell them before they come into bloom. It'll just help to regulate that height until they're ready for sale. It's just not practical to bring them into bloom and sell flats. Vinca vine, a lot like Ipomoea, really responds quite well to multiple applications of Florel. And something that's really interesting that it does increase branching, but unlike most other plants, the breaks are not coming up from the inner nodes of the part of the plant that was sprayed. What happens is it'll actually send them out from below the soil line, and I find that to be really useful. It's just it makes the plant much thicker at the base, and at the same time, every time you apply Florel, it reduces internode elongation to keep them getting quite so long and runny. But once the Florel wears off, they go back to vining, so the final customer gets the long trailing habit that they're usually looking for with Vinca vine. Controlling the height on flowering Vinca has been a challenge for many years, and part of the issue is that when you use higher rates of bonsai or sumagic as a foliar spray, such as are pictured in the top picture on the slide, you get black spotting that looks like a foliar disease. So it's really uncomfortable with that. Some research that has been done by Brian Whipker, and we've followed up with some of our growers on this. Top floor might be your answer. You can do a great job with a foliar spray. I think for most of our growers, the 2.5 part per million rate is what you're looking for. Midsummer or southern part of the United States, you might go as high as 5 parts per million, but most of our growers are quite happy with just 2.5 parts per million of top floor. There are some drench options available, and I want to thank Joe Moore at Lucas Greenhouses for this slide. And they were comparing, of course, you've got your control plants that weren't treated with any PGRs on the left, but then you can see a progression, a 0.5 part per million bonsai drench, which did not cause the black spots on the leaves. and then 2 different rates of top fluor there. And the first thing that might jump out at you, especially in the case of bonsai, there's absolutely no bloom delay. You might argue there's more open color on the bonsai treated flat than the control. But I think you take a look there, you can use as low as 1/8 of a part per million of top fluor and get very good height control. So there are some good options out there, and growers are an innovative lot, and they have continued to work at different patterns. They finally got something they really like here. Really hope that you enjoy this presentation and other similar ones that GGS Pro presents. We're always open to your feedback on new topics or how we can present this material in a different way that might help you more. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see our contact information, both by email and also for our phone number. That's our GGS Pro Technical Group extension, and anybody that picks up the phone there can help you with your PGR questions. So thank you so much for being a part of this online presentation.